Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Larry Parks Show. I'm Larry Parks, and this is the Extreme Consumer Activism Show. We talk about how ordinary people get ripped off by the system. And the system we've been most concerned about for the last 3 years is the monetary system. Tonight I'm going to be finishing the third part of a three-part series on why the monetary system violates Jewish law. But before I get started, I just want to comment on how Jon Stewart nailed Mr. Greenspan the night before last when he asked Mr. Greenspan that when the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates, aren't savers getting the short end of the stick? Because savers get less interest on their savings. These are ordinary people. Greenspan did not have a good answer to that. He said to Mr. Stewart, he said, why don't you read my book? And Stewart did not mention, of course, that not only when they lower the interest rate do ordinary people lose interest on their savings, but also their savings depreciate. It becomes diluted by the extra money that the Federal Reserve turns out. So I want to turn now again to how the monetary system violates Jewish law. And the Jewish law that I'm concerned most about, that everyone should be concerned about, is something called Genivas Das. I'm going to give a quick recap of what this Jewish law is about, and then I'm going to recap very quickly what the first two sessions were about. Let's go to the first slide, please. Genivas Das is the Jewish prohibition. It's the next slide, please. The Genivas Das is the Jewish prohibition against deception. Genivas is the verb form of the Hebrew word ganef, which is a thief. Genivas is to steal. Dat is your mind, literally to steal one's mind. But really it's to deceive. And so the literal meaning of Genivas Dat in Hebrew is theft of one's mind, thoughts, wisdom, or knowledge. That is fooling someone and thereby causing him or her to have mistaken assumption, belief, and or oppression. Thus the term is used in Jewish law to indicate deception, cheating, creating a false impression, and acquiring undeserved goodwill. Let's go to the next slide, please. But this concept, the next slide, please. But this concept of Genivas Das goes beyond lying. Any words or actions that cause others to form incorrect conclusions about one's motives might be a violation of this prohibition. One does not have the right to diminish the ability of another person, Jew or Gentile, to make a fair and honest evaluation, whether in business or interpersonal relationships. Go to the next slide, please. This prescription against Genivas Das is included in the transgression, thou shalt not steal. So in other words, stealing someone's knowledge or deceiving someone, it's part of the Ten Commandments. And Torah explicitly states, distance yourself from false matter. And finally, the last slide, please. The sages believe that there are 7 types of these, and of these, the most egregious is the one who steals the minds of the people. In other words, to deceive people at large, that is the worst crime of all. And finally, the next slide, please. This is not a minor prohibition, and the sages thought, and says Absalom, the son of King David, deserved death for violating the Torah law against Genivas Das. And by the way, this comes from a terrific essay on the internet by Hershey Friedman. Come back to me, please. So what I talked about in the first two sessions of this, first I spoke about how the money that we use deceives people into thinking that the founders endorsed it, when in fact all of the founders spoke against paper money. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Paine, and others. And I showed exhibits of the bills that we now have, the Federal Reserve notes, which have the photographs, pictures, likenesses of these presidents on the bills as if they had endorsed it, when in fact they never would have given their imprimatur to this. Jefferson, of course, thought the paper money was a cheat, and they all did, as did Madison, and all of these people appear on the paper money. Then I spoke about the misrepresentations on the paper money itself, the fact that they're called notes. They are not notes. In order to be notes, you need a payee and a due date. And it used to be that the notes, the payee was the bearer and the due date was on demand, but that was taken off. But they're still called notes. And that is an out-and-out misrepresentation, violation of Jewish law. And then I spoke about how the monetary system violates the provisions in the Constitution, which does not allow for paper money. And as a matter of fact, the Constitution only gives the general government the power to coin money. And this was the understanding of the founders. Let's go to the next slide, please. And tonight I'm going to be talking about misrepresentation by banks and non-disclosure of material information. Misrepresentation by banks and non-disclosure of material information. Come back to me, please. So part of the prohibition against misrepresentation, the Canivus Das commandment, is that you're not allowed to leave people with the wrong impression. And particularly, you're supposed to do full disclosure. Now, we have in the United States, in the securities field, for example, there's something in the Securities and Exchange Regulation called the 10b-5 rule. And the 10b-5 rule says that you have to do full disclosure. So when you sell stocks to the public, if you leave important information out, you are violating the 10b-5 rule, and it is a felony, and you can go to jail. In states like California, when they sell you real estate, if that real estate is in an earthquake zone, you have to disclose to the potential buyer. You cannot say everybody knows that California is an earthquake zone. You have to disclose to people that it's in an earthquake zone. In the field of the monetary system, however, as you'll see momentarily, very material information is not disclosed, and people are wildly, they just don't know, and which is one of the reasons why the people who produce the irredeemable paper ticket money, which is not the government. People think the government produces all our money, when in fact it's all produced by the banking system. These people are violating Jewish law. Let's go to the next slide, please. So first I want to talk about misrepresentations by banks. So banks promise, and you've all heard this since you were little kids, you can get your money back on demand. This is a false promise. It's really a contingent promise. And really what they need to say is you can get your money back provided not too many people want to do so at the same time, that the banks haven't lost the money, that they haven't tied it up for long periods in investments and it's not available, and they never disclose the risks to which they put that money. Come back to me, please. So in other words, if I asked you to lend me, say, $10,000 or any substantial amount of money, what goes through your mind? What's the first thing that comes to mind when someone says to you, lend me some money? And the answer is, well, how do I know I'm going to get my money back? And what's my security in case you lose it? And what are you going to do with the money? The banks don't tell you any of this stuff. In fact, they tell you you can get your money back on demand. But again, this is a false promise. It's really a contingent promise. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then they misrepresent the basic banking relationship. The notion of calling it a deposit is a misleading term, because money deposited in a bank in law and in fact becomes the bank's money. And the bank may then use that money any way it wishes. It can buy real estate, make loans, gamble, or whatever, and the money goes on the bank balance sheet as a liability, and the depositor is in fact and in law an unsecured creditor. Come back to me, please. So people are not mindful of this. So again, if I asked you to loan me money, you're going to look to see what I'm going to do with that money. You're going to be concerned about the collateral. You're going to be concerned about the safety. But if I tell you you're a depositor, now I'm misleading you into telling you that, and really not disclosing to you, not giving you the full story on what's happening with your money. And in this way, the banks are misrepresenting the basic relationship. And again, this violates Jewish law. Let's go to the next slide, please. And here I show you that the absence of risk disclosure, the fact that the banks misrepresented the basic banking relationship, this led to lax what they call counterparty surveillance. This is when you would ask me questions, what are you going to do with the money? That's called counterparty surveillance. And as a result of this lack of counterparty surveillance, the banks are able to leverage up. And in fact, when the banks extend a loan, they create the money for the loan. It's a book entry. Come back to me, please. So people don't understand how this works. They think that the banks are really intermediaries, that they put money in the bank, and the bank then takes that money and loans it to somebody else at a higher interest rate. That is not the case, folks. In fact, when the bank loans money to somebody, they don't take money out of anybody's account. So if you put money in a bank, that money stays there. I mean, you have a book. When I say it stays there, you always have a claim on that money. When a bank loans money to someone else, whether it be for a mortgage or for a car loan or for a credit card and whatnot, it creates that money out of nothing. This is not properly disclosed, and this is what they mean by bank leverage. So again, the banks are misrepresenting to the people. Now, what does the Federal Reserve have to say about this? Well, it turns out a couple of years ago, a fellow by the name of Patrick Parkinson, who is an associate director of the Division of Research and Statistics, gave testimony before the Committee on Banking and Financial Services and the House of Representatives, and here's what he said exactly. Let's go to the next slide, please. He says, if market discipline is to be effective, counterparties of a firm, these are, say, the people who deposit money in a bank, must obtain sufficient information to make reliable assessments of its risk profile, both at the inception of the credit relationship and throughout its duration. Furthermore, they must have in place mechanisms that place limits on the credit risk exposure that become more stringent as the firm's riskiness increases and its creditworthiness declines. Come back to me, please. None of this is present when people put their money in banks. So out of the very words of the Federal Reserve officials, the banks are misrepresenting to people, they are violating Jewish law, and this leads to instability in the monetary system. And of course, the instability leads to loss of savings, loss of pensions, loss of jobs, loss of annuities, and as I speak to you, sad to say, folks, the wheels have come off the cart completely, and this system is spiraling out of control, not only in the United States, but around the world. And now I want to turn to the issue of non-disclosure of material information. So what information would be proper to include on the irredeemable paper ticket money if they were going to do full disclosure? Well, first and foremost, they would have to disclose that the dollar no longer has what's known in the scientific world as a unit of dimension. And there's a little story to this. So it seems when Isaac Newton, one of the most brilliant men who ever lived, say for Aristotle, maybe the most brilliant man who ever lived, as a reward to Isaac Newton, at the end of the 17th century, the British made him the warden of the mint. He was in charge of the mint in Great Britain. And shortly after he became warden of the mint, the Bank of England, which was on the gold standard, and what that meant was that the bank would issue putatively redeemable paper money that was supposedly redeemable into gold on demand. But it turned out that nobody's going to get their gold. And why would they? What do you do with the gold once you got it? Better to leave it in the bank. And so the bankers came to Newton. They said, well, let's forget about the gold. I mean, no one's redeeming it anyway. Just let's go with the paper money. And Newton answered not as an economist, not as a moralist. He answered as a scientist. And what he said, if you break the link to gold, the paper will no longer have a unit of dimension. What a unit of dimension is, it's a matter of weight or distance or volume, but something you can actually measure. So if there's no link to gold, the paper money has no unit of measure. And Newton was so brilliant and so well regarded at that time. For 200 years, the British did not break the link to gold. Today, our money has no unit of dimension. It is just what they call an illusion. Sometimes you see in the literature it's referred to as a unit of information. This is all perfect nonsense. So in other words, you work all your life, you save, you put away for retirement, and what do you have? You have something that's just ink on paper or little blips in a computer pointing you away. You don't really have anything. And in fact, what you've noticed, if you've been around for a while, is that in the last 50 years, the purchasing power of this money has declined by something like 90-some-odd%. In other words, if you had saved your money from the 1950s on, you've lost more than 90% of the purchasing power just on the money. How can that be fair? How can that be honest? And in fact, it's not honest. And of course, I think one of the primary things is that there is no link to anything in the real world with the money. Let's go to the next slide, please. Today, our money is no longer next slide, please. Today, our dollars are no longer redeemable into anything. Come back to me, please. This is something that's not disclosed on the money. In the last show, I showed you a sample of a dollar bill where it said at the bottom, it was a promise to pay $1. It actually had that picture of George Washington, and at the bottom it said it was a promise to pay $1. And then they took that promise to pay $1 off, and the broken promise to pay $1 became $1. And so the paper money, it's just a piece of paper. I mean, sure, you can get somebody to take it, maybe, but what's happening now all over the world is that the dollar is losing purchasing power at a very quick rate. And in fact, at the end of the day, it's going to go like all the paper money has always gone since the time of John Law in the middle of the 18th century, early part of the 18th century. And that is the purchasing power of paper money always approaches its cost of production, which is near zero. And that's what's in the cards, folks. So the dollar is not redeemable to any. This is something that's not disclosed, that ought to be disclosed if they were honest about the paper money. Let's go to the next slide, please. Dollars have value because people believe that other people, both at home and abroad, will continue to accept them for their goods and services. Come back to me, please. This is something that it's assumed, that somebody else is going to take these dollars. But I can remember, I'm old enough to recall that in 1971, on August 15th, when President Nixon reneged on the sovereign promise of the United States government to redeem dollars at the rate of $35 for an ounce of gold to central banks, when he broke that promise, there was havoc in Europe. Americans who were in Europe, they couldn't use their dollars to buy plane tickets to get home. And so this notion that always that somebody around the world is going to accept the irredeemable paper tickets for their goods and services, this is not disclosed, the fact that this is what's dependent on here. And one of the things that we depend on very strongly here at home is imported oil. We use something on the order of 22 million barrels a day, and of those 22 million barrels, roughly 12 or 13 million barrels are imported. And what are they paid with? They're paid for, how do we pay for them? We pay for them with the irredeemable paper tickets. Well, who gets the money? Well, people in Saudi Arabia, people in Nigeria, people in Venezuela, but all around the world now, people are starting to question this. And various countries like Venezuela and soon Russia and others are not going to accept dollars for their oil. They're going to be paid in something else. Of course, the something else is also irredeemable paper tickets like euros or yen, and all this stuff's going away. But let me tell you, if we don't have those extra 12 million barrels of oil a day, America shuts down, and in particular, California shuts down. Another fact which is not disclosed on the irredeemable paper ticket money. Let's go to the next slide, please. They don't disclose to folks that dollars are created flat out of nothing by the U.S. banking system, mostly by commercial banks. Come back to me, please. Now, this is very important. In 1946, we had in America roughly $150 billion. Today, according to the Federal Reserve, it's something in the order of 12 trillion. Now, they stopped publishing that number. It's called the M3 number. There are proxies for it. When they stopped publishing it, it was something up to something like 11 trillion. So where did all this extra money come from? And the answer is it's just book entries in banks. Of that roughly 12 trillion, the Federal Reserve created about 800 billion, flat out of nothing. That's their whole balance sheet. The other 11.2 trillion was created flat out of nothing by banks. And of course, they get interest and fees for creating this money. And the bankers and the whole Wall Street crowd, they have become fabulously rich on this. And ordinary people who save their money, as Jon Stewart pointed out to Mr. Greenspan the other night, these people get the short end of the stick. They're losing the interest on their savings, and of course their savings are depreciating. This is as egregious dishonesty. I mean, it's institutionalized stealing on a worldwide basis, and they're really stealing from ordinary people for the benefit of a very small clique of very well-to-do people in the financial field. That's what's going on. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, here's a disclosure that ought to be made, and this is a fact. So if, in the judgment of the Federal Reserve, there needs to be additional liquidity, read liquidity to mean additional money in the system, then the Federal Reserve may create additional dollars, and I put in dollars in quotation marks because in no way are these dollars related to the dollars mentioned in the Constitution, in unlimited quantities. And this generation of additional dollars will dilute the purchasing power of dollars that have been saved or promised for future payment, such as pensions or annuities. Come back to me, please. So in other words, they need to disclose to people. I mean, if they were honest, if they wanted to give people the correct impression about what this money is about, they'd have to let you know that the Federal Reserve stands ready to create money without limit. And these are Mr. Greenspan's words, and he said this many times, not just one time. This little book that I wrote about him, What Does Mr. Greenspan Really Think? You can get it from Barnes & Noble, or it's a free download off the FAME website. Several times he said that the Federal Reserve stands ready to create money without limit. So if you and I say when partners in some small business and the business issued each of us, say, 50 shares of stock, so we're 50-50 owners, but I have the right to issue additional shares in unlimited quantities to my friends. I could dilute you down to zero. And that's exactly what's happening, folks. So people who have saved or have promises of future payment, pensions, annuities, or whatnot, the money being created, in effect, depreciates their ownership. And even people like Madison, James Madison, when he was president of the country, pointed out that the fact that the paper money is really a violation of property rights. In other words, you're stealing people's savings. So this is another thing that really needs to be disclosed right on the bills. So if you want to do proper disclosure, you have to show people right up front, not in some esoteric way where they have to go search on the internet to find this out. And this is not being done. Let's go to the next slide, please. They would have to disclose also that the creation of these new dollars flat out of thin air has depreciated the dollar's purchasing power by more than 90% since 1950. Come back to me, please. Who's even mindful of the fact, when they talk about inflation at 2%, this is nonsense. I mean, anybody who's in the real world knows that the money is depreciating something in the order of 8-10% a year. And I have showed you in prior programs the studies put together by John Williams of Shadow Government Statistics, where he showed that this consumer price index methodology, the way they actually compute it, has been changed 4 times since the Clinton years. And in fact, the money is being depreciated maybe 8-10% a year. Let's go to the next slide, please. They would need to disclose as well, if they were going proper disclosure, that dollars are in no way obligations of the U.S. government. So sometimes you hear this notion that dollars have the full faith and credit of the United States government. The signatures of the Secretary of the Treasury and the Treasurer are gratuitous. Come back to me, please. So if you look at your bills and you see those signatures on them and whatnot, that's part of the design. I mean, the government is not promising to do anything. I mean, the government has really almost nothing to do with this. This has all been delegated to the banking system, and the banking system is robbing people blind. Let's go to the next slide, please. They would have to disclose, in order to do full disclosure, that dollars are just tokens. They're paper tickets. Come back to me, please. So in other words, it's not even real money. It's like play money, except they made it legal tender. And the fact that it's legal tender means that if you don't accept it, you don't have to be paid. So if I owe you, or if we have a dispute and it's adjudicated in a court, the court is going to award the aggrieved party damages in the legal tender. And so the legal tender, which again is created flat out of nothing, it may have no value whatsoever, that's the stuff that's used. Mr. Greenspan, by the way, in a letter to Ron Paul, now running for president, actually stated that as long as we have fiat money, arbitrary, irredeemable paper ticket money, we have to have legal tender. Let's go to the next slide, please. I've already covered this slide. Go to the next slide, please. This is the one where I talked about the money creation going from 150 billion to 12 trillion. Go to the next slide, please. Here's another disclosure they would need to make, that the United States government has extended roughly $7 trillion in guarantees, mostly to government-sponsored entities. These are people like Fannie Mae or Ginnie Mae. And should these guarantees be called, then there's risk that significant amount of additional dollars will have to be created, thereby diluting the purchasing power of dollars that have been saved or promised for future payment, such as pensions. Come back to me, please. So in other words, the promise, the guarantees that the government makes, these are not properly disclosed. Who even knows about these guarantees? And in fact, in addition to the guarantees to companies like Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae and whatnot, they have guaranteed the entire balance sheet of the banking system. So the bank's assets are systemically guaranteed by the so-called lender of last resort, which is really not a lender, it's just a bailout. And that bailout window is open today, folks. And they can accept as collateral and change into money rotten bananas if they want. I mean, anything they want, they can change into money, and they will change into money. And this fellow Bernanke, who runs the Federal Reserve, for whatever reason, he is not mindful of how this depreciates the savings and the purchasing power of seniors and people who are on pensions. People who have retired on annuities and whatnot. These people are getting cheated by this system. Now let's go to the next slide, please. And this is really the most significant threat which really needs to be disclosed, and that is the so-called rocket scientists on Wall Street, through financial innovation, have created something like $400+ trillion in derivatives. Derivatives are just bets. Come back to me, please. Now, of this 400+ in derivatives, and I have a chart to show this. Why don't we put the chart up? It's the next slide. Of this 400+ trillion, and this chart ends in 2006. It shows about 380, but it's north of 400 today. Of those derivatives, roughly 130 trillion is in United States banks, and of that 130 trillion, 125 trillion is in 3 banks. Come back to me, please. And those 3 banks are J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Bank America. Now, what does this mean, derivative bets? These are just gambling. As a matter of fact, if you read the financial press, like the Financial Times or whatnot, they actually refer to these derivatives as bets. These bets are all off balance sheet. So in the event that the banks win these bets, and they win them a lot, they get to keep the money. Should something go wrong, then you pay. How do you pay? Well, the Federal Reserve stands ready to bail these banks by creating money without limit. Without limit, which means anything that's denominated in dollars will become depreciated. I don't know how people buy into this. And I don't understand how our so-called, actually I do understand, but I don't like it, how our so-called elected representatives let this get by them. How people like Mr. Schumer now, who's complaining bitterly about the plight of the people who got sucked into these subprime mortgages, how come he's on the Senate Banking Committee? Why doesn't he say something about this business, the risk that the money will be depreciated to zero? And what is the contingency plan for the Federal Reserve and for the Treasury in the event, I should say, when this actually occurs? And the answer is de facto martial law. And as I speak, there is now on the White House website a national security directive which in effect gives the president plenipotentiary power in the event of what they call a national catastrophe. And among the catastrophes that they're concerned about is an economic catastrophe. And right at the bottom of the list of all these economic catastrophes is if people lose confidence in the financial system. If people lose confidence in the financial system. Well, let me tell you, folks, the only reason people lose confidence in the financial system is because it doesn't deserve their confidence. And it is, in effect, it is corrupt, it is dishonest. They are cheating ordinary people out of their savings, out of their promises of future payment, and it is really disgusting. And the bottom line here, the point I want to make is that this violates the Genevas Das Commandment in Jewish law. Jewish law condemns this kind of behavior, and anybody who's Jewish, or especially people who are observant Jews, should take note of this. Well, I'm right down at the end, and this concludes my 3-part presentation on how the monetary system violates Jewish law. It's been a real honor and privilege to come into your homes to present to you on this. Thank you very much. And lastly, you can put up that last slide now. You can leave that up. If you feel this kind of presentation has been useful to you, please consider a small contribution to the Foundation for the Advancement of Monetary Education. This is a 501c3 public charity. Your contributions are fully tax deductible as provided by law. And again, thank you very much for your kind attention, and I hope you'll tune in again next week. Thank you very much, and God bless, and good night.